A new balance of power emerged in Europe in 1871. The inhabitants of that continent would spend the next half-century adjusting to this new situation, and in particular, the rise of a wealthy, powerful, and aggressive new empire in Germany. In fact, the first signs of tension would come miles away, on the fringes of various European empires, but those tensions would not be resolved until Europe itself had exploded into a war such as the world had never before seen, a war that would set the seal on modern times. And so the next few lectures have a long-term goal: to trace the long-term causes of what we call World War I, but which Europeans still call, rather more ominously, the Great War. In this lecture, we'll see that the seeds of that war were first planted abroad during the mad scramble for colonies which obsessed the great European powers at the end of the 19th century. Now, there's something funny about this, because for the half-century before 1870, imperialism had gone out of fashion, or it was at best a low priority for the great states of Europe. Why? Well, first, liberalism. Following Adam Smith and American independence, most European statesmen had come to realize that they could profit from, even exploit a place, without the trouble and expense of governing it or defending it. Remember the continuing healthy trade between Britain and America after 1783. After the French Revolution and rise of liberal reform movements, it was harder to justify imperialistic domination of other peoples. As we've seen after 1820, successive British governments, in particular influenced by Bentham and other liberals, withdrew from the Holy Alliance and took a hands-off approach to South American independence. By 1830, Spain and Portugal had lost their overseas empires to such independence movements. France, of course, had lost much of its colonial empire after the 7 Years' War. Russia retained a vast empire in Eurasia, but withdrew from the Pacific Northwest and sold Alaska to the United States. Only the Dutch and the British retained large overseas empires. The Dutch retained Sumatra, Java, Borneo, and New Guinea in the Far East. The British held on to Canada, Cape Colony, later on South Africa, India, and Australia. But even this was controversial. In 1852, the Tory politician Benjamin Disraeli opined, "The colonies are millstones round our necks." Only the United States continued to expand its empire westward after 1815, for reasons that I'm going to leave to another course. In Europe, nationalism further prevented the rise of empire. Many intellectuals saw imperialism as a contradiction of nationalism. You can't give other people national self-determination if you're going to rule them as imperial powers. Places like Germany and Italy were, as we've seen, preoccupied with their own nationalism problems. So why did all this change around 1870? Well, I'm going to offer 5 reasons for the mad rush for empire between that year and 1914. They are economic, military, religious and racist, the popularity of empire, and what I'll call the spirit of competition or empire envy. First, economic. It is true that the old mercantilist ideas of men like Colbert had been exploded by Adam Smith. But that did nothing to stop individual Europeans from trying their luck abroad as entrepreneurs. In fact, the Smithian laissez-faire doctrine of free trade encouraged it. By 1800, free trade policies had broken the monopolies of the old great trading companies. The only one left was the English East India Company. Free trade allowed individual traders, used to be called interlopers when there were still companies, to go anywhere: Lagos, Rangoon, Singapore, Karachi, up the Congo, the Niger, the Ganges, the Yangtze, and the Amazon. But there was a problem. These men were entrepreneurs. They were not anthropologists. They rarely understood fully the cultures of these places. They seem to have assumed that Western attitudes prevailed here too. They expected locals to be free traders as well, and so they expected to be able to buy and sell freely, with minimal interference from local rulers, religious authorities, or native populations. In fact, these traders were often perceived by the locals as ignorant, arrogant, and totally insensitive to native power structures and customs. I'm going to give you 2 examples from the British experience. Insensitive example number 1 is the British in China. Trade with China was strictly regulated, European trade with China was strictly regulated by the emperor. Europeans had to trade through specific ports and merchants. Now, beginning in the late 17th century, the British began a very lucrative trade in tea. That's really when tea starts to take off in Britain. But the British had nothing of comparable value to sell to the Chinese, so they had to trade silver bullion. Now, according to mercantilist theory, that's a no-no. It impoverishes the nation. And so the government of George II complained. The Emperor Qianlong wrote back, "We possess all things. I set no value on objects strange or ingenious, and have no use for your country's manufactures." But for many of his subjects, there was an exception: opium. Opium was cheaply grown by the British in India. It was increasingly demanded by the native Chinese, and it was outlawed by the Chinese government in 1796. The resultant smuggling trade reversed the trade imbalance for Britain and increased the problem of addiction for China. In March of 1839, Chinese government officials confiscated British opium at the docks. But that, of course, interfered with free British trade. And as a result, the British fought the First Opium War to force the Chinese to buy their opium. Insensitive example number 2. In India, the British East India Company had taken advantage of Indian disunity to make favorable treaties with local rulers all through the 17th and 18th centuries. By 1850, the company had conquered or dominated most of the subcontinent. It also retained the largest army in India, a private army. Beginning in 1853, the British failed to address a rumor that was floating around the Indian Army, which was mainly staffed by natives, that the tips of cartridges, which had to be bitten off in order to fire from the new Lee Enfield rifles, were greased with pig or cow fat. Now, Hindus, of course, regard cows as sacred animals, and Muslims are prohibited from eating pork. The British largely failed to address the issue. The British Commander-in-Chief, George Anson, said, "I'll never give in to their beastly prejudices." In May of 1857, the Indian Army rebelled. Hundreds of British soldiers and civilians were massacred. As a result of events like this, European governments increasingly felt they had to step in, not because they wanted colonies per se, but to protect trade. In China, the British and French fought 2 opium wars, 1839 to 42 and 1856 to 60, to force the Chinese into free trade. Stop and think about what that means for a moment. This resulted in the opening of China to European trade and a 99-year lease of Hong Kong for the British. European diplomats were now allowed in Peking. But of course, it eventually contributed to the fatal weakening of Chinese government and to a growing opium addiction among the Chinese population. In India in 1858, the British gradually retook the country, launching savage reprisals, often slaughtering whole villages. This process became known as the Devil's Wind. They dissolved the ancient Mughal Empire and the East India Company and took over the government of India directly. In 1877, Victoria became the Empress of India, a British viceroy ruled by British law, supported by a vast British Indian army with a higher proportion of British officers to keep them in line. Using similar economic justifications, the British also took over Singapore in 1867, the Malay Peninsula in 1874, Egypt in 1882, Burma in 1885. Hence the reversal of the phrase, trade follows the flag, to the flag follows trade. Now, a second cause or justification for empire was military. Put simply, once you acquired a bigger backyard, particularly one overseas, you had to protect it. And you had to protect the route to it. Once again, the British provide the classic example: India. India had been the lucrative jewel in the crown long before the official takeover of 1858. But India was on the other side of the globe and took weeks to reach by ship. To protect that route, the British gradually acquired colonies as way stations. I'm going to name off the Cape route. First came the Cape route around the Cape of Good Hope. Important way stations included St. Helena, acquired in 1659, Sierra Leone in 1787, Cape Colony, South Africa itself in 1815, Mauritius in 1814, the Maldives in 1887, and Ceylon in 1815. But of course, once the Suez Canal opened in 1869, everything changed. the British began to concentrate on protecting that route. So now the Mediterranean became more important. Gibraltar, which had been acquired in 1713, Malta in 1814. Egypt, the home of the Suez Canal, more or less went bankrupt in 1882, so the British, remember, not because they want colonies, just to protect their trade, moved in and simply took over. That in turn led to interests in the Middle East and the Persian Gulf. That explains the British interest in Somalia and South Arabia in 1884 and their 1920s acquisition of Palestine and Iraq. Now, of course, the viability of Egypt depends on the Nile. So the British began to worry about this as the Germans moved into East Africa in the 1880s, so they practically had to grab Kenya in 1886 and the Sudan in 1898. They continued to protect Cape Colony, South Africa, especially after the discovery of diamonds there, by bagging Bechuanaland, now Botswana, between 1884 and 88, Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, between 1890 and 91, and Swaziland in 1907. So it was all done to protect the jewel in the crown and the jewels of South Africa. Now similarly, the French conquered most of West Africa in order to protect their original holdings in Algeria. Later in the century, Russia would push into Korea to protect its Pacific port at Port Arthur. So note how previously remote places on the other side of the world, India, for example, suddenly become intimately bound up with the national interest. Note how those places could in turn make other places. Egypt and Somalia become important because they're important to India, and so they become part of the national interest. And pretty soon, the national interest is defined so liberally that everybody's national interests are bound to clash. And that's why this is a long-term cause for World War I, more later. The third reason for the colony grab had to do with racism, often backed by religion. This is what used to sometimes be called white man's burden. This was the belief that Christian Europeans, having achieved such a high level of civilization by the mid-19th century, were superior to other peoples, and therefore had a right, even a duty, to bring the fruits of their civilization to less developed peoples. Where did this idea come from? Well, a lot of its roots were religious. In the medieval and early modern periods, Christians were used to thinking that they were the only ones with true knowledge of God and the path to salvation. This not only imparted a sense of superiority over infidel peoples, it also implied a duty to convert them. As early as the 16th century, Spanish and Portuguese missionaries preached Roman Catholicism to Central and South American Indians. In the 17th century, French missionaries did the same in Canada and the Great Lakes region. Simultaneously, Catholic missionaries, for example Jesuits like St. Francis Xavier, accompanied traders to China and Japan and India and Africa. Beginning in the 18th century and increasing in the 19th, Protestant churches in Britain, the Netherlands, and Germany began to send missionaries into Africa. And in the 19th century, Catholic French and Belgian missionaries went to West and Central Africa. Now, all of these groups built churches, hospitals, and schools. They introduced native peoples to Western religion and medicine and technology and commerce. But they also behaved arrogantly towards native cultures and traditions, sometimes forcing conversions, almost always destroying native shrines and undermining native beliefs. Now, in the 19th century, the religious impulse was added to by science. 19th century science was widely thought to be another one of those features of Western life which demonstrated the clear superiority of European culture. As we've seen, Darwin's theory of natural selection and its corollary, the survival of the fittest, impeccable as scientific theory as they may be, when applied to the natural world, were used by social Darwinists to justify the European class system and white man's exploitation of Africans and Asians. After all, hadn't Europeans proven themselves superior by virtue of their ability to travel to, defeat, rule, and exploit these very people? It's a circular argument. We're justified in taking over your lands by virtue of the fact that we've demonstrated that we're powerful enough and smart enough to take over your lands. The relatively new science of anthropology was also used to justify European superiority, again by virtue of a circular argument. 19th century anthropologists spent a great deal of time dividing the peoples of the world into different races and describing the physical characteristics of those races. They then would explain to their readers how certain characteristics were associated with refined blood and civilized behavior. Of course, those characteristics were always those of Europeans. Now, modern geneticists and anthropologists pretty much reject the notion that physical characteristics indicate any kind of superiority or degree of civilization. And they increasingly reject the idea of separate races, given the idea of the degree of intermixture of which we all tend to be products. But 19th century religion and science, combined with economic and military interests, were all used to justify the carving up of half the world, the exploitation of its inhabitants, the eradication of native cultures, all by Europeans. Like most other groups of people which have decided to interfere in the affairs of another, they saw this as a duty as much as a right. In a famous poem published in 1899 after the American takeover of the Philippines, Rudyard Kipling expressed these sentiments by writing White Man's Burden, urging the U.S. to become an imperialist power, and even arguing that white men were engaged in personal sacrifice by doing so. And I must warn you, the portrayal of non-Europeans as childish, sullen, silent peoples is pretty offensive. Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go, bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need, to wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new-caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child. Take up the white man's burden, the savage wars of peace, fill full the mouth of famine, and bid the sickness cease. And when your goal is nearest, the end for others sought, watch sloth and heathen folly, bring all your hopes to naught. We will address his claims and his charges later. For now, the poem helps me make the point about the fourth great cause for the imperial land grab, popularity. The literary career of Rudyard Kipling, Kipling's Jungle Book, Conrad's novels, the tons of boys' adventure stories that were produced in the 19th century, newspaper articles of distant battles, all remind us that imperialism was popular. It was like the space program for the 19th century. People of all ranks liked the idea of having an empire. Though it denied the nationalism of others, to some nationalists it fit the notion of their own country's superiority. The upper and middle classes liked it for the economic benefits, and as ancient Rome, imperial frontiers were good places to make a career and a name. Young Winston Churchill is a wonderful example. The working classes liked empire. We're actually not quite sure why. Vicarious thrills, maybe diversion from their own misery, but they liked it. Now, failing all else, by the 1880s, the great powers of Europe were acquiring colonies because they could, because they didn't want to be left out. It was a matter of keeping up with the Joneses. And so my fifth reason for the great land grab was just the sheer logic of competition. A country simply had to have overseas possessions if it was going to be taken seriously. So, okay, that's my reasons for why empire happened. How big did these empires get? And what were the consequences? The British Empire was the granddaddy of them all. By 1900, for reasons explained above, it comprised 1/4 of the world's landmass and 1/5 of the world's people. And because it stretched around the globe, it could truly be said that the sun never set on the Union Jack. That flag flew over Arctic tundra, the jungles of Nigeria, the veldt grasslands of South Africa, the rolling, English-like pasture lands of New Zealand. It flew over Aborigines and French Canadians and Egyptians and Irishmen and Arabs and Maori, Ashanti, Zulu, Christians, Jews, Hindus, and Muslims. All governed from London, their thousands of local customs theoretically subordinate to English statute and common law. All these places supplied raw materials for the juggernaut of British industry: grain, gold, timber, and dairy products from Canada, gold, copper, and wool from Australia, tea, cotton, silk, and jute from India and Ceylon, oil, rubber, tin, and rice from Burma and Malaysia, cotton from Egypt, sugar from Jamaica, diamonds and gold from South Africa. All provided bases for and were guarded by the Royal Navy. At its height in the 19th century, the Royal Navy was larger than any other two navies in the world combined. It safeguarded the intricate web of trade routes, establishing a Pax Britannica, a British peace. This refers to the ancient idea of a Pax Romana across the globe. In addition, the British invested heavily in Japan, in China, in the Ottoman Empire, in the United States, and in Central and South America. Wealthy Britons made the world their playground, traveling everywhere as explorers, Stanley, Shackleton, and Scott, as scientists, Darwin, as tourists and expatriates. It became very fashionable to live abroad, especially in Italy. The British gave us new words to describe their empire, like Raj, and Cook's Tour, named after Thomas Cook, the famed British travel agent. Posh, the abbreviation Port Out Starboard Home, which was written on steamship bookings. And you wanted this next to your name on the steamship booking because you wanted a cabin away from the sun if you did a southern voyage. The British spread their games abroad. Lawn tennis, rugby, football, squash, and cricket are nearly all far more popular worldwide than baseball. Is it any wonder that everyone else wanted an empire? Now, France resurrected their empire in the 1830s, mostly in North Africa. You'll remember Napoleon's interest in North Africa. They acquired Algeria in the 1830s and 40s. They moved into Senegal beginning in the 1850s, but that conquest took until 1901 to complete. French West Africa was added 1876 to 98. The French Congo, 1875 to 92. Madagascar, 1895 to 96. And Morocco, completed in 1912. Britain's colonies were far more lucrative. In fact, if you stop and think about all the places I've described, think of the high proportion of sand. They just didn't have the same kind of industrial significance as the British colonies did in terms of supply of raw materials. Now, in one of the strangest pieces of French ambition, in 1863, Napoleon III also attempted and failed to establish a puppet French regime in Mexico under the Archduke Maximilian of Austria. Neither the United States government nor the Mexicans were terribly thrilled with that. The French also acquired Asian and Pacific interests, the Marquesas Islands, including Tahiti in the 1840s. You'll all know the importance for that of the art of Paul Gauguin, Vincent van Gogh, and maybe Marlon Brando. They acquired Indochina, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam between 1859 and 1893. Now, other powers got into the game later, and so their pickings were even less lucrative. Germany, as you know, only united in 1871, so they got a late start. That left them pretty much with some African territory in the east, Togoland, now Togo, and Cameroon in 1884, and German Southeast Africa, now Tanzania, in 1886. You may remember the connection here to the film African Queen. In the Pacific, they picked up the Bismarck Archipelago in 1885, the Marshall Islands in 1888, the Marianas and Carolinas in 1899. Italy was also a late starter and almost totally confined to the poorest sections of Africa. Eritrea in 1889, Somalia in 1893, Libya in 1912. And finally, there was Belgium. King Leopold II had supported some of the exploration of Henry Morton Stanley to explore the Congo. And in recognition of this, just of the fact that he'd more or less been there first, the Congress of Berlin of 1884 gave Leopold control of the Belgian Congo and its lucrative rubber trade. Now, Leopold's project was to establish a monarchy that would be free of democratic interference. He's an old-style absolutist. So the idea would be that he wouldn't have to call a parliament because he would be so wealthy from the exploitation of the rubber trade. To pay and impose rubber tax, the whole population of the Congo was mobilized, including children, and forced to work in rubber plantations. If they failed to hit quotas, their right hands were chopped off. Eyewitnesses record buckets of hands being shipped back to local offices to display as a warning. The photographic evidence is amazing and shocking and terrible. Perhaps 5 to 10 million people died under this regime. It is perhaps the most brutal of all the imperialistic regimes. Early in the 20th century, reports started to filter back to Europe from the British diplomat Sir Roger Casement and the journalist E.D. Morel, and the world was forced to take notice. In 1908, the Belgian parliament assumed control, and that led to a gradual liberalization of the work regime. Now, the experience of the Belgian Congo raises, I think, the whole issue of the ethics and significance of European imperialism. Let's set aside for a moment the question of whether Europeans had any right to be there. Let's survey the effects of this project. Now, an optimist would point out that Europeans had brought with them religion and philosophy, science and medicine, drugs, hospitals, modern surgery. They'd brought technology, the telegraph, railroads, construction equipment. They brought economic development. Places like Africa and India were incorporated for the first time into a world economy. And they brought the notion of the rule of law to places which sometimes didn't have it. Remember the famous scene at the beginning of the film Gandhi when, after being thrown off of a train, Gandhi shouts, "But I am a subject of the British Empire," the implication being subject to its laws. But of course, he was thrown off of that train, and that brings me to the pessimist case. Against the optimist case, a pessimist would point out a legacy of bigotry and cultural insensitivity, economic exploitation, pollution and destruction of natural environments. By carving up Africa across tribal lines, Europeans left it a linguistic and cultural mess. Native cultures were destroyed or modified beyond recognition. Now, I'm fully aware of the fact that not all native cultural practices were admirable. A good example might be suti, the practice in India of self-immolation for widows, which is outlawed by the British at the insistence of reform-minded Hindus in 1829. Now, the question of what gives one culture the right to interfere in the affairs of another is one that I am not going to solve for you. But what is clear is that native cultures missed out on 200 years of their own development and interaction. While Europeans certainly brought many good things, one would be hard-pressed to argue that most of them, the missionaries apart, did so for altruistic reasons. The infrastructure Europeans established was designed for extraction of raw materials, not local development. The beneficiaries of that extraction were overwhelmingly European. Few economic benefits accrued back to the conquered lands. This created a widespread suspicion of European-style government that later held back democracy. Why would people be attracted to democracy, any product of European culture, given this legacy? Tribalism and corruption were ways for native people to resist and to cope. But that left a bitter legacy in Africa to this day of blood, tribalism and corruption, bloodshed and poverty. Now, none of this absolves native peoples completely in their own demise. Local African and Indian rulers with no sense of nationalism often engaged in their own brutal tribal warfare and slavery. They cooperated with Europeans for their own particular advantage. One more final effect of European imperialism deserves our attention. It brought Europeans into conflict with each other in new places far from home, often when they would not otherwise have had a quarrel. For example, in Africa in the 1870s and 80s, the British and French bumped into each other along the Gold Coast and the Sudan. They nearly started a war at Fashoda near Khartoum in 1898. In the 1890s, Germany encouraged a revolt of the Dutch Boer settler population against British rule in South Africa. The Boer War of 1899 to 1901 produced terrible atrocities on both sides, including the first use of concentration camps for non-combatants, women, children, by the British. Thousands died. In 1905-06 and 1911, the Moroccan crises. Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany supported Moroccan independence from the French. Then there was the Eastern question. As we've seen, a crumbling Ottoman Empire left a vacuum in the Middle East into which the great powers of Europe wanted to insert themselves. To maintain the balance of power, the British, the French, and Piedmont Sardinia, none of whom border Russia in Europe, allied with the Ottoman Empire against Russia in the Crimean War, 1853 to 56. Allied victories at the Alma River, Balaclava, Inkerman, and Sevastopol resulted in the Treaty of Paris of March 1856. Russia was forced to give up Bessarabia to the Ottomans. Moldavia, Wallachia, and Serbia were placed under international control, and the Russian fleet was barred from the Black Sea. This war finally broke up the old Holy Alliance, but it also did something else. It caused the Russians to start to look east. Now, Russia had been advancing into Siberia for centuries, and that began to make it a Pacific power. In the 1860s, Russia, stymied at the Black Sea, sold Alaska, but gained territory on the north coast of China, in particular establishing the port of Vladivostok. It began to eye Korea, and in 1894 leased Port Arthur, now Lushun. Between 1904 and 1905, the Japanese, wanting to nip Russian ambitions in the bud, attacked Port Arthur, and the result was the Russo-Japanese War, a disaster for the Russians. The period 1890 to 1914 would also see the virtual collapse of China, all the European powers jockeying for trading rights. In the Pacific, there was a massive land grab for naval bases all throughout the 1880s and 90s. There were disputes over the Samoan Islands, divided between Germany and the USA. The British got the Solomons. In 1898-99, the USA dramatically upped its presence by taking the Philippines from Spain. Now, the significance of all this is that it added to the resentments and suspicions that European powers had for each other. It caused conflicts between states that would not normally have shared borders. In particular, British supremacy was being challenged by a rising German empire led by its aggressive Kaiser. If the sun never set on the Union Jack, Kaiser Wilhelm publicly pledged to win for Germany its place in the sun. And so Europe's imperial addiction would be the first of the long-term causes of the Great War.